Hello, I'm the Northern Luddite and I have a confession. When I was growing up in the early 90s, there's nothing I enjoyed more than walking the streets and hitting random people over the head with a length of lead pipe while listening to rave music. Yes, I played Streets of Rage. Now while other Sega franchises from the early 90s have been resurrected or continue to limp on, Streets of Rage began and ended with 3 Mega Drive games. There have been no further attempts to cash in on the name and I'm glad. These 3 games still stand up now. They've been re-released on pretty much every main games format over the past couple of years, and while time has been unkind to some games of the early 90s, this trilogy still plays well to this day. So here's my not exactly exhaustive retrospective on a classic gaming trilogy. Now before we go any further, I just want to put to bed one of the main criticisms of the series. At the time of the sequel, the originally titled Streets of Rage 2, all the Nintendo fanboys used to say this was just Sega's attempt at Street Fighter 2 and they were wrong. It was actually Sega's attempt at Final Fight. Of course, Final Fight did look quite similar to Street Fighter 2, but that's because it was kind of a sequel to the original and mostly forgotten Street Fighter. The big difference between Streets of Rage and Street Fighter is that one is a simple one-on-one beat-em-up and the other is a scrolling beat-em-up. Street Fighter 2 is a simple versus game. You played one character and the other was either played by the computer or by a friend. Streets of Rage involved beating many other characters, and if a friend joined in, they were your ally rather than your enemy. That's not to say that Sega didn't borrow certain elements, the Dragon Punch and Fireball anyone, but the gameplay mechanics were very different. So, on with Streets of Rage. The first game was released for the Mega Drive in Japan under the name Bare Knuckle. It wasn't unknown at the time for games to have different names in the East and West. For example, the Magical Flying Hat Turbo Adventure was renamed Decap Attack and the graphics were completely changed. Unlike that game, the first of the Streets of Rage games had very little changed in them when they were ported to the West. Released in 1991, the game features 3 vigilantes taken to the streets of Rage City to clean up the town and to take down Mr. X, the shadowy crime syndicate boss. While the Mega Drive had been released a few years before, this was one of the first wave of top-quality titles for the machine. The early games had either been arcade ports like Golden Axe and Altered Beast, or quickly put together sports games. By 1991, Sega were getting to grips with their new machine, and in the same year, released Sonic the Hedgehog and ToeJam and Earl. Now, back when the PlayStation was released, the big thing which Sony sold the console on was the fact it fitted into popular culture. Wipeout was pretty much sold on the fact that it included club music from the big names of the time like Orbital and the Chemical Brothers part of the soundtrack. But back in the early 1990s, Streets of Rage had a soundtrack based on early 90s rave music. The composer, Yuzo Koshiro, who also wrote the music for the Shinobi series of games, had been in England at the end of the 1980s and been inspired by the rave scene, something which was reflected in the music of the Streets of Rage trilogy. The music was so well received, all 3 game soundtracks were commercially released in Japan and are still sold for large sums on eBay. The original game consisted of 3 characters walking the streets and beating the hell out of members of the crime syndicate. You could either play a 1-player game where you chose between Adam, Axel or Blaze, or a 2-player game where each player chose one character. As well as the usual attack and jump controls, there was also the special attack where you could call for police backup. If you pressed A and had special attack saved up, you could clear a screen of enemies or take a lot of damage off a boss. Each level had a boss with an energy bar, but all the other enemies simply took a set number of hits to knock out. The game went through several locations including the streets, a beach, a riverboat, a factory and the Syndicate headquarters. The final level was particularly entertaining as you rode up a lift to the top floor of the Syndicate building before going inside and fighting your way through to Mr. X. There were a variety of bosses including a giant head with scissor hands, 2 women who looked a lot like Blaze, a man who had clearly eaten too many pies and had fire breath, and finally Mr. X who was armed rather unfairly with a machine gun. There was a certain grittiness to the game which stemmed from the story of vigilantism, but there was also a touch of surreal silliness which kept things from getting too dark. The game also kind of gave you the choice of 2 endings. When you first made it to Mr. X, he would ask you if you would like to join his syndicate. If you said yes, you would return to an earlier level and had to fight your way back. If you chose yes again, the game ended with you as his right-hand man or woman. It wasn't a particularly good addition, but it did create a little more replay value than if it didn't have this option. Now, my description of the final level probably has you saying, are you sure you aren't thinking of Final Fight? Well, they were more or less the same in that way, but Streets of Rage was a much faster game. It built on the Sega attitude of edgy characters and fast adrenaline gameplay. In fairness, the first game of the trilogy does look rather dated now. In fact, it looked dated within a year. It was still the early days of the console, and Team Ancient was still getting to grips with the new hardware. Because of this, it was amongst the first games which had their prices slashed as the next couple of waves of games were released, and it found itself on the second Mega Games compilation which was bundled with new Mega Drives. The idea of putting multiple games on one cart wasn't new, but it was quite unusual to put several of the previous top-end games on one. Of the 3 original Mega Games collections, Streets of Rage was on number 2 alongside the solid Revenge of Shinobi and Golden Axe, making it the best of the 3. The second game in the trilogy was released late in 1992 and was fairly heavily overshadowed by both Sonic 2 and also Street Fighter 2. However, despite this setback, the game is good enough not to be forgotten and is viewed by the majority of gamers as the best of the three. Once again, Axel and Blaze have to fight their way through the evil syndicate on the streets of Rage City, only this time they are doing so to rescue the third character from the original game, Adam. Adam was the best character to play as in the original, but Axel is by far the best option in the sequel. While his jumping abilities are not great, he is by far the most powerful move in the game, and once you have mastered the Grand Upper, you'll not really need to do another move. Blaze remains the best all-rounder, and they're joined by a wrestler named Max and Adam's kid brother Skate. The two new characters look like they're novelty additions, but while Max is too sluggish to really want to choose, Skate is quick enough and has enough amusing moves to make selecting him worthwhile. Rather than a suplex, he can jump up on the enemy's shoulders and pound away at their head. His flying kicks are also the most powerful in the game thanks to the rollerblades he wears. The main difference in the gameplay mechanic is there is no longer the option to call for police backup, but each character now has two special moves which likely deplete their energy when you use them. As with the original game, Streets of Rage 2 takes the player through the streets of Rage City, through multiple stages ending in the headquarters of Mr. X. Once again, the last level involves a lift, and most of the bosses you would face through the game. I don't want to say too much about what you come across throughout the game as you might want to play it, and I wouldn't want to spoil the surprise. Let's just say that each level has multiple stages, there's a baseball stadium with an underground wrestling match, and there are two robots. Once again, the game has a dark theme which is added to by the excellent soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro. At the same time, there's enough silliness to keep things from getting too nasty. In fact, I'm with Fire Breath at the back, and as I said, there are robots. If you're going to play a Streets of Rage game, this is the one to go for. The levels are big, there's a decent challenge, and the soundtrack has probably never been better in the field of video games. Now, Streets of Rage 3 is generally viewed as a disappointment. After the second game of the series pretty much nailed everything, the third game didn't really have anywhere to go. This certainly isn't a bad game, the gameplay mechanic is more or less the same, but nothing is quite as good as in 2. The first difference is the difficulty. The second game was criticised for being a bit too easy, especially if you played as Axel, and when the Japanese version was reviewed in American and European games magazines, it was also criticised for being way too easy. Because America and Europe were the main Mega Drive markets for Sega, Sega of America made the game much more difficult. Enemies had more energy and better AI. The downside to this was the game just wasn't as pleasurable as the first two, and things can get a little too manic. While there were parts of 2 when the screen filled, you always felt you could get out of it, whereas in 3 you kind of knew you were going to lose a life. The special moves not only cost energy but were also far less powerful, even the ones you didn't hit the A button for were weakened, and instead of being able to continuously do the old Axel Grand Upper, you just had to wait for a bar to charge for moves like this to really have any effect. Just to make things more irritating, enemies could also take power-ups which you left lying around. In the original 2 games you could leave a health power-up until you decided you needed it, but now as soon as you saw it you had to grab it or it was going to be gone. This took away a nice little tactical side to the game and it was a nasty shock when you first found out. The storyline of the game also feels a bit like a Jump the Shark. For the first time a Streets of Rage game used cutscenes to help explain what was going on, but you didn't really need this in the other games as the stages you progressed through kind of explained it for you. The storyline was about the Syndicate using a robot Axel to try and find the real Axel. They also kidnapped the mayor and placed him with a robot and, well, it's all as mad as a box of frogs really. The richness of the originals is replaced with a silliness which only occasionally reared its head in the first 2. While one was sorry to see Max be left out of this game, the replacement was a half-human, half-robot scientist, and it wasn't really a great step forward. Even the music wasn't as good as the first 2, but there were some good levels. The part in the club was fantastic, but there were some strange bits including where you have to fight a bulldozer and later a samurai. No, really. The game has a good and bad ending depending on how you do in the last level, but you only really get a proper ending if you play the game on normal, which means that the much more enjoyable easy setting robs you of the end of the game. I wouldn't say this is one to miss, as it is still an enjoyable game, but unless you're a collector I would recommend getting it on a compilation rather than buying an original. Apart from anything else, the original Mega Drive release didn't sell particularly well, and this has forced the eBay price up to the point where I bought my copy for the same as what it would have cost new. While it is now slightly cheaper due to being re-released on the Virtual Console and on the 360 and PS3 Mega Drive collection compilations, it is still very expensive for a Mega Drive game. Before I sign off, I should also just mention that there were also 8-bit versions of the first 2 Streets of Rage games made for the Master System and for the Game Gear. Sega did make 8-bit versions of a number of Mega Drive games in order to try and push the Game Gear and also keep the Master System owners happy, which included Castle of Illusion, the Sonic games, and also Streets of Rage. The first 8-bit Streets of Rage was released in 1993 and was a reasonably faithful conversion. The 2-player mode was removed, but all 3 characters and all the levels and bosses made it in. The music was also pretty much the same, though obviously of a lower quality. Overall, it's hard to fault it. The Game Gear version was a little difficult to play due to everything being shrunken down from the smaller screen, but it was a faithful conversion. The second Streets of Rage game was less well converted, but then it was always going to be near impossible to take a game which required a larger than usual Mega Drive cartridge and convert it to all the 8-bit consoles. This version was also one player only, removing both the cooperative gameplay and the versus mode from the Mega Drive version. It also missed out a character, but then as it was Max, it wasn't exactly the end of the world. The levels were different as well. Round 2 and 3 were completely different, and a couple were missing altogether. Once again, it does play well, and the soundtrack is once again taken from the Mega Drive version, but really this was a conversion too far. It is a bit of a rarity, but not one worth seeking out unless you're a bit of a completionist. Well, that's the Streets of Rage trilogy. I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective. I'm the Northern Luddite, and I'm off to smack a punk over the head while listening to rave music.